Hi, this is Greg Remke, and this is a presentation on the WHO 2020 topic on significantly relaxing labor regulations in times of high unemployment. This is take two trying to record this. The first one I spent 15 minutes getting through the first slide. So let me just give some economic views on labor regulations and human flourishing. So labor regulations, where do they come from? What are they about? Why do we have labor regulations? Well, to protect workers would be one answer, but then the question is what other laws or norms protect workers? We used to have a time without labor regulations. What was the status of workers then, and what were the protections that workers had? And the argument here is labor unions also try and protect workers separate from regulations, or companies themselves have an incentive not to injure their workers or make them sick because the workers are less productive and they get sued. So what other norms are there in society? And in fact, there's the common law, the source of law that isn't government, that comes over time as courts adjudicate disputes. And this is mostly in England and the United States with common law heritages. So in the areas talked about in the listing here, as examples, they have workplace health, safety standards, minimum wage, working hour restrictions. So we'll talk about those as we go here. So again, how is it that wages rise? A minimum wage law is the idea there is you want to have some minimum, either a living wage or some way that people can wages aren't driven all the way down. But it leads to the question, why do wages rise? Do they rise because government keeps mandating higher minimum wages, or do they rise for other reasons? And economists argue that wages rise because productivity increases. Companies are in business to earn income, to make products, and to make profits for their investors. And so for that, they need capital and machinery. They need managers and entrepreneurs, and they need workers, they need land, and they hire more workers because the factories don't operate on their own. The question is how many workers do they hire and for what reason? One example often used is a contractor building a swimming pool. So he's a swimming pool contractor. He comes in, he makes a bid to make your swimming pool. People agree to pay some amount, let's say a $20,000 swimming pool. Contractor comes in with his bulldozer, his backhoe, his various equipment, and his workers. And so he's got somebody running the bulldozer or the backhoe. He's got people helping. But the question is, how many people? How many people do you hire to do the shoveling, preparing, getting things ready for the backhoe? It's the backhoe that's multiplying human productivity, right? So because with the backhoe, the laborer can earn a lot more than if you just had 20, 30, 50 guys with shovels. The backhoe can do more than 1,000 people with shovels. But how many people does he hire? Well, the first guy's helpful, the second guy's helpful, the fifth guy, speeds things up for the backhoe. But once you get to the 10th, 12th, 15th person, on the margin, each additional worker ends up not adding to labor productivity. The workers are tripping over each other, falling in the pool. There's just too many people. So at some point, each additional worker is slightly less valuable than the worker before for the contractor who's building the swimming pool. So that contractor makes his or her decision on hiring the additional worker on the basis of how much additional productivity that worker provides. If the minimum wage is $20 an hour, then as soon as marginal worker productivity falls below $20 an hour, the employer stops hiring. If the minimum wage is $10 an hour, then maybe they'll hire a few more people because they can do something on the side that's worth at least $10 an hour. These are decisions that the manager has to make. They're decisions that the workers make because they choose among different job opportunities. But setting a minimum wage doesn't raise wages as much as it cuts off how many people the company hires. In my area, I'm near an airport. One of the parking centers where you park your car, they would hire high school kids to wash people's cars. So you park there and you get your car washed. When you get your car back on the end of your trip, your car is nice and clean. It's something, people like when they work there or when they put their cars there. But when the minimum wages were raised, I think to $15 an hour in the town of SeaTac, where the airport is, this particular company stopped hiring high school people to wash the car. It was a benefit in general, but it wasn't worth $15 an hour to them, or they felt to the customer. It's a decision the managers have to make, but the higher you raise those wages, the fewer people you hire. A place like that, if it's big enough, might also decide instead of hiring high school students to wash the car, just to get one of those big car wash things and then just have the car zip through those. That's what the rental car companies do. So that might cost $10,000, $20,000 to get one of those installed, but that's a substitute for labor. So what happens when you raise wage rates? You encourage companies to hire more equipment or build more equipment. So you raise minimum wages at McDonald's. McDonald's puts in more of those kiosks where people just push buttons to order their hamburgers or order through their smartphones. So again, the wages companies pay has to do with productivity. So one of the reasons to not have minimum wage laws is that when you have those laws, you increase unemployment. And this topic says they want to reduce unemployment, or they want to reduce regulations in a time of high unemployment. This is one way to do it. In the book Law, Legislation, and Liberty by Friedrich Hayek, he discusses sort of the broader history of law as separate from legislation. And of course, legislation is separate from regulation. So for example, in the United States, we have legal norms, we have labor law that nobody passed, that developed early on, absorbed from English common law, except in Louisiana that had French law. You had labor rules that common law judges would interpret when there were disputes between employers and employees. And these weren't passed by the Continental Legislature or even by the British Parliament. They were pre-existing law. And this is what's called judge-discovered law or judge-determined law. The judges figure out how to resolve disputes looking at precedents from other judges. So this is law without legislation. And in England, legislation comes later. The British Parliament didn't used to pass legislation, very little. Most of the law was pre-existing, discovered by judges as pre-existing. And this is the relationship between employer and employee. Then comes legislation. In the US, it was a progressive era that based on the idea of classes, or that somehow capitalism was opposed to the interests of the workers. You had to protect the workers with regulation, and this is where US labor law, the Department of Labor, came from. Then over time, instead of Congress passing legislation to protect workers, the Department of Labor just created more regulations, as sort of a legislative purpose, but within the executive branch. So now you have a situation where the Department of Labor has its own judges, has its own legislators, has its own executives, that you don't have division of separation of powers. Same with the EU. So the EU regulators are developing their own rules of how to deal with the gig economy or how to deal with this and that. What Hayek is saying in his classic 3-volume book and in his early book, Constitution of Liberty, is that we should look at the different sources of law, labor law versus legislation, and there are significant advantages to judge-discovered law, that is the law of the land, rather than top-down legislation to try and help workers and so forth. And this comes up in the next section, intentions versus results. The labor laws are intended to help protect workers, help protect them from being arbitrarily fired, help protect them from being taken advantage of, help protect their safety and their income, or limiting the number of hours they can work. These all sound good, but there are certain significant problems. For example, in the debate club, your debate league could pass a regulation or a rule that says nobody can spend more than, let's say, 3 hours a day researching their debate cases in preparation for a tournament, because Students have other work to do. They've got schoolwork, and maybe they're so wound up in debate they can't help themselves. So just like your parents might say you can't play video games more than an hour, the debate league or debate club head might say you can't research more than 3 hours a day or 3 hours a week. But the challenge is people that have more time to research often do better, right? So the student that researches 10 hours a day might win the tournament. Similarly, in China, for example, where people are very, very poor, people migrated from their villages to the factories. This is since the 1990s, 200 million people in the floating population leaving their villages, going to the city, living in dorms, working at really low wages. And these people want to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week. They don't like being poor. They don't like being away from their village. They'd like to put in a ton of hours, 12 hours a day, as many as they can, to earn money. And they do that when they're young with the hope that they can save money to send back to the village, improve their skills, work less later. If, in law firms, the juniors that just started law firms, it's normal to work 60, 70 hours a week because that's how you get ahead in a law firm. Now, you can't do that in a factory in the US because of labor regulations, but what that means is for people who don't like being poor and can't earn enough in 40 hours a week, they have to go out and get another job. And so they get another job as an Uber driver or something else, making less money than they would if they could have worked longer at the factory. So we may say that these labor regulations on hours help people, but they help keep people poor. Now, from the standpoint of safety, you might say, well, look, a truck driver going 70 hours a week falls asleep and crashes the truck. Well, in those cases, it's in the strong interest of the trucking company to make sure people only drive when it's safe. So they don't want sleepy drivers because they pay millions of dollars when they lose, when the trucker kills people and wrecks the load and so forth. So safety is an issue that government's interested in, unions are interested in, companies are interested in, and their insurance companies are interested in, which doesn't mean that everything is as safe as it could be, but there's strong incentives to improve safety, and we don't quite know the best way to do it. So, as an example, a friend of mine's father ran a farm in Argentina, had a bunch of employees growing vegetables. He finally decided that he couldn't make money for various reasons with this farm, and he had to shut down. But he couldn't afford to fire his employees because Argentine labor law made it way too expensive, and the training you had to employ and all these sorts of things you had to do. So he basically bribed his employees to quit and shut down the company. But let's say a year later he decides he should start again because there's new opportunities. Well, he's not going to. If you make it hard to fire employees, you make it equally hard to hire employees. So in Spain and France, for example, they have all these labor regulations making it really hard to fire people, which means that companies choose not to hire young workers. Instead, they take interns. So young people in their 20s get all sorts of internships, but very few offers for full-time jobs because jobs come with these protections and contracts. In the US, we have a policy called employment at will. So you're hired for a job, you're working there, and the boss comes in one day and says, look, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go. Well, the employee in Europe could say, well, wait a minute, we have a labor contract. Or wait a minute, you have to give me a reason to let me go. And then if they don't like the reason, they can go to court and sue. You say, well, gosh, it's unfair that people could be arbitrarily fired. Well, if you don't allow employers to let people go when they want to, they will be very careful about who they hire. And they won't hire people. They'll take an intern or a part-time worker or hire somebody from an employment company, because if you don't let people go, again, they will be reluctant to hire. And I'm afraid I've said that 10 times. I apologize. But you can see the incentives involved. Let's say you start your own restaurant. You want to hire more people, but all of a sudden business goes down and you've got to let people go. If you're not allowed to do that, well, now I've said the same thing 11 times, so I apologize. Okay, this is from a separate debate topic that was, I think the STOA Debate League was considering the U.S. federal government should substantially reform one or more laws administered by the Department of Labor. This is the same sort of case as the WHO motion on relaxing labor standards. So again, labor unions and government agencies try to protect workers from being exploited by companies. But what do we mean exploited, taken advantage of? Why can't, employees take care of themselves? And that's because it's considered that there's an unfair, that the companies have more power than the workers. Big corporation with 1,000 employees, you're going in to apply for a job. The sense is they have a lot more power than you do. They have lawyers, they have whole departments, human resources departments. You either do what they say or you don't. Well, in reality, when the economy is thriving and growing, you've got 25 companies, and you look at different companies as a potential employee and you choose who you want to work for. Companies compete to hire you because they see you as an effective employee who could help make them money. So you choose the company you want to work for. They choose among the dozens of people who apply. Now, employers make mistakes and employees make mistakes. It could be they hire somebody who turns out to be the wrong person. It could be you take a job at a company that turns out to be the wrong one. You think, gosh, I shouldn't have taken this job. I should have taken that one. You want it to be easy to say, thank you, I apologize, this isn't working, and leave. And you want the company to be able to change its mind too. We don't have the knowledge of what things are going to be like until we do it for a while. So that's one reason to have flexibility in employer-employee arrangements. These worries over being exploited are part of the gig economy. So in California, Uber and Lyft and other companies, delivery companies, hired workers working on gigs. That is, you get paid per person you drive, per something you deliver. I get stuff delivered from Amazon and Instacart and others, and that person gets paid a certain amount of money for delivering this stuff, so much per delivery. And I don't know how much they should get paid. I don't know how much they do get paid. But if the workers don't like it, they'll stop working for that company and try to work for somebody else. If the delivery people, the company is not making money, they'll go out of business or they'll raise their prices. That's a complex dance between workers, between companies, between the services they provide, and we don't know the best way to do it. The state of California passed legislation saying, look, no more gig economy. Uber and Lyft have to hire everybody as full-time employees. They accused those companies of exploiting their workers, of doing this gig stuff just so they could avoid paying benefits, mandatory health benefits, mandatory retirement benefits, other sorts of benefits. Benefits are a big part of the costs for employers. So were they exploiting workers? Well, how do you make that decision? One way is to say it's voluntary. The people decided to work for them. The companies decided to hire them. What we want is enough alternative jobs that people can go to the jobs that pay better. And do we have an ideal society? No, we don't, particularly with the lockdown and pandemics. It's been a challenge around the world. So the WHO motion says, let's relax these regulations till we can drop unemployment. The unemployment levels are huge, particularly among young people in Europe and many places around the world. It's interesting, unions used to be essential to the earlier gig economy. The way unions actually worked, at least one part of the unions outside of the auto industry and so forth, is that there would be a bricklayers union, let's say in Seattle, and when you're a contractor, a home builder, you needed bricklayers and you didn't have bricklayers on your staff. You would call up the union hall and say, I need 4 bricklayers for 2 weeks of work. And they would send 4 people out to your place who were certified union bricklayers. So the union ensured that they had the skills and you didn't have to worry about figuring out how to hire bricklayers and fire them. So a bricklayers union started up in San Antonio, I think 10 years ago. I was reading about trying to do the same thing, certify worker capability and then send them out to jobs. That's not the way most unions work today, but it's a point that just because people are critical of today's unions doesn't mean they're necessarily critical of unions in general. It's just that most companies, there's only one union now. So the auto workers union, how is that better than the automobile companies themselves? There's just one auto union, I think, in Detroit. But auto companies are thriving in America, but they're thriving in Tennessee, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, and all those companies are non-union companies uh, from Korea, Japan, Germany, and different unions from Germany. But in any case, yeah, distraction there. So unions, federal regulations trying to protect people. The argument is that federal regulations arbitrarily increase the power of unions, and according to the pro-market people, later critics said no, Reagan and the Republicans reduced labor union strength through labor deregulation. So you've got a back and forth over whether labor law currently makes unions weaker or whether it before made unions arbitrarily strong by giving them special advantages, right to work laws, and so forth. And that's for students to research. Okay, some books on freedom of association. Cato has a labor law and regulation page. Um, the argument, yeah, so I'm going to skip. Lots of fascinating things to look at in this topic. You can read more online. And I'm going to skip through this. So here's a point on the title of this is Who Left 13 Trillion on the Table? When we critical of labor regulations, worker safety rules, other sorts of things, it's not we want to put workers at risk, but the challenge is these regulations are costly and many times are arbitrary. And economists argue that these regulatory systems get captured by the people who benefit from them. So regulatory capture theory is what Susan Dudley is discussing in this video. I think this URL should take you to the link on economic thinking, although that looks different now. Yeah, and we have all sorts of labor restrictions. Another aspect of this topic is professional licensing. So people that want to be hair braiders in Mississippi and other states have to take thousands of hours of training on using chemicals for coloring hair, even though African American hair braiders don't color hair. Those laws are there to protect people in the cosmetology industry and to protect them from hair braiders. So these various regulations make things worse. Restrictions on food cards. They're sort of food safety, but actually they're protections from the restaurants, and the restaurants lobby the city government to stop food cards because they're seen as competition. So this means less jobs are available, less opportunities for entrepreneurship. So these are some of the things I write about in my posts on economicthinking.org. And again, the final point on this for the European Union and for the US and other countries, the Department of Labor is a legacy of the progressive era. This is part of the era that was worried about the big trusts, the big corporations, and said workers need special protection. They can't just rely on freedom of contract and employment at will. These new and this is from actually the Department of Labor in the US government. I would argue it's not a good thing to be part of the progressive era. Of course, progressives would disagree. But this is the website number 6, Progressive Ideas. They were convinced that job safety and health was too important to remain solely with the responsibility of employers. And of course, the counterpoint to that is it's actually the insurance companies that were concerned with safety. So you're an employer and the critic says, well, we can't rely on you. You just want to make money. But that employer has an insurance contract, multi-million-dollar insurance, and that insurance company sends an adjuster out to your factory, and that guy looks around. And if he or she finds things that are unsafe or risky, they write you up and they will mandate that you change your rules, or they will raise your rates or cancel your policy. So it's not to say that we're relying only on employers. Employees quit if it's dangerous. But also insurance companies come in. When I was in college, I worked for a company, Firestone, that put hubs on these giant tires that were put on airplanes. And there was a huge safety contraption to protect the workers in case the tire exploded. But the guy, and this was a summer job, the guy I worked for didn't use it because it slowed down the process of putting these tires on the hubs. So I mention that because that's my personal experience. I have no idea how much more safe it was. I was a college kid and that was the way it was at the company. But Maybe it's the case that this guy was taking a risk that the insurance company would have been against if they knew about it. So no inspectors from the state ever came in while I was there, no inspectors from the insurance company. Secretary of Commerce stressed the great enemy of this country is waste. It takes the government to establish the rules of the game to assure fair play for workers and others who would not protect themselves. So this is the view of the progressives, that there's waste in the economy and the government was going to help root it out. The Progressive Party at the time declared the supreme duty of the nation is the conservation of human resources. So these progressive era programs were administrative rulemaking, various commissions trying to decide what proper health and safety was without having to go back to the legislature. So back to our original theme, you've got law that comes with judges deciding who's at fault when somebody gets injured. Then you have legislation where the legislature passes labor legislation, but then you have departments like the Department of Labor, and they make their own rules. And so every year when you get tens of thousands of new labor regulations and other regulations made by the EU or the US, state labor agencies, the question is, do these actually make workers safer? Are they more beneficial than costly? And how do we determine that? And that's part of this topic and part of the history. Okay, thank you very much for listening.